It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Kevin, lost and alone in the big city, came to the shelter simply because he no longer knew where to turn from his own emptiness. Among dozens of mournful eyes, he chose the most unremarkable, the most frightened dog, whose days were numbered. He just wanted to give someone a chance at life, expecting nothing in return, not even understanding. It was a small, almost invisible gesture in a vast, indifferent world. He led the dog out of its cage, naming him Tramp, and had no idea that this unassuming, silent companion would become the only one to remain by his side when his whole world collapsed, and that one day, in the darkest moment, this very dog he had saved would repay the debt 100-fold, pulling him from an abyss so deep there seemed no way out, even for a human. Kevin lived in Chicago, a city teeming like an anthill, a city of millions, where everyone was rushing somewhere, where neon signs blinded the eyes and the noise of traffic never subsided. But amidst this hustle and endless motion, Kevin felt like an absolute zero, an invisible grain of sand in a vast desert. He was 30 years old. He had a job, boring, unloved, but enough to make ends meet. There was a small, rented apartment in a residential neighborhood where the walls seemed too thin and the neighbors too distant. He had acquaintances, colleagues, a couple of guys from the gym with whom he exchanged a few words. But there was no one who truly knew him. No one waiting for him at home. No one who missed him when he wasn't around. Loneliness. It had been his faithful companion since childhood. He grew up in a single-parent home, his mother always away at work, leaving him alone. In school, he was the odd one out, not athletic, not sociable, preferring books and quiet to noisy games. His first timid attempts at relationships ended in painful disappointment and even greater withdrawal into himself. Over the years, loneliness became a habit, and then, a part of him. He stopped seeking connection, convincing himself it was easier, safer that way. The world around seemed cold and hostile. People, selfish and calculating. Every interaction required effort, every conversation, pretense. Kevin learned to wear a mask of indifference so no one would see his vulnerability. He lived on autopilot, work, home, store, internet. Days bled into one another, leaving no trace, bringing no joy. A sense of meaninglessness gradually ate away at him from the inside. What was it all for? What was the point of the effort? For whom? He often walked in the evenings, wandering aimlessly through the streets, looking at the lit windows of houses, imagining the people inside, families, couples in love, noisy groups of friends. He felt like an outcast, a person behind glass, watching other people's lives, lives he couldn't access. The emptiness inside became unbearable. One such evening, passing a dilapidated building on the outskirts, surrounded by an old fence, he heard barking. Hundreds of voices, muffled, mournful, desperate. He stopped. He read the sign, City Shelter for Homeless Animals. Until that moment, he had never even considered the existence of such places. There was no room for animals in his world. But the barking drew him in. There was such unconcealed pain in it, such pleading, that it somehow resonated with his own inner pain. For several days, he just walked past, listening. And then something changed. The feeling of emptiness became so acute that he felt the urge to do something, anything, that had meaning, even if just for someone else. And so he went into the shelter, not to get a dog, just to look, to see those who, like him, were unwanted by anyone. The shelter greeted him with the smell of dampness, wet fur, and despair. Rows of cages, behind which sat dozens of dogs, large and small, young and old, purebreds and mutts, each with its own story, its own hope in its eyes, or with the extinguished gaze of resignation. Hundreds of eyes fixed on him, as if he were their only chance. Kevin walked along the rows of cages, feeling awkward. He didn't know what he was doing there. A shelter employee, a tired woman with kind eyes, offered him a tour. She told him the stories of some of the dogs, their names, their fates. Kevin listened, but his gaze wandered. And suddenly, he saw him. At the very end of the row, in a corner cage, sat a dog. Small, a mutt of indeterminate color, with his head hung low. He didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't even look at Kevin. He just sat curled in a ball, as if trying to become invisible. It seemed he had completely resigned himself to his fate. In his eyes, when he happened to glance up, there was neither hope nor fear, only infinite sadness. The shelter employee sighed. Him? Poor thing. He's been here a long time, completely withdrawn, doesn't trust anyone. Sick, they say, and getting old. Most likely, well, you understand. Kevin understood. Most likely, he would be euthanized. Something inside Kevin stirred. This dog, lost, alone, with that extinguished gaze, he was so much like Kevin himself. His own loneliness, his own feeling of being unwanted, suddenly took physical form in this small, doomed dog. He didn't think, he just felt it, felt a connection. The connection of two lonely souls in a vast, indifferent world. "I'll take him," Kevin said, surprising even himself. The shelter employee looked at him in surprise. "Him? Are you sure? He's difficult." "I'm sure," Kevin repeated. At that moment, for the first time in a long while, he felt not emptiness, but purpose. A small, simple purpose. To save. To give a chance. Processing the paperwork, the veterinary checkup, confirming the dog's poor health, but not a death sentence. Buying a leash and collar. It all felt like a dream. Finally, he stood at the shelter exit, holding the small, trembling dog on a leash. The dog didn't resist, but showed no joy either. He simply walked obediently beside him, pressing close to Kevin's legs. His gaze was still full of sadness. "Hey, Tramp," Kevin said softly, crouching down. The dog flinched at the unexpectedness, but didn't pull away. Kevin carefully reached out and stroked his coarse fur. The dog didn't respond with affection, but he didn't bite. It was the first, timid step towards trust. He led Tramp out onto the street, into the noisy city. The dog was clearly scared, ears flattened, tail tucked. Kevin walked slowly, talking to him in a quiet, soothing voice, not expecting him to understand. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how to care for a dog, especially a sick and frightened one. He had no experience, no support. There was only him, Tramp, and the huge city where they were both lost. He had come to the shelter to fill the void, to save another soul. He didn't know that this unassuming dog, this Tramp, would become the very creature who, without knowing it, would save him from himself, from his loneliness, from his despair. He didn't yet know that their small, quiet story would become an illustration that the most important things in the world truly cannot be seen with the eyes, and that the most important salvation comes when you least expect it, and from whom you least expect it. The first weeks with Tramp were a real trial. The dog turned out to be even more difficult than the shelter employee had warned. He wasn't aggressive, but completely withdrawn and distrustful. He feared every sudden noise, every stranger. When Kevin tried to pet or soothe him, he would cringe or turn away. He only ate when Kevin wasn't there. He relieved himself right in the apartment, despite attempts to house train him. At night, He whimpered softly, tossing on his bedding as if tormented by nightmares. Kevin's apartment, never cozy to begin with, turned into a place of constant mess and odor. Torn wallpaper, puddles on the floor, fur everywhere. Friends, if his acquaintances could be called that, stopped coming over. "Are you crazy, Kevin? Bringing some flea-bitten wreck from the shelter?" they'd say with disgust. Even the rare phone calls stopped. Kevin was left alone with the dog he himself had chosen. Problems started at work. Lack of sleep affected his concentration. His thoughts constantly returned to Tramp. Had he eaten? Had he made a mess? How was he doing alone? Kevin became distracted, made mistakes, received warnings from his boss. He felt even this boring but stable job slipping away. His already precarious life began to crumble under the weight of this small creature that he had taken upon himself. There were moments of complete despair. Kevin would sit in the kitchen in the middle of the night, looking at Tramp sleeping in the corner, and ask himself, "Why did I do this? Why did I condemn myself to this?" He felt terribly tired, lonely, and powerless. Caring for himself was already an overwhelming burden, and now the responsibility for another living being was added, who didn't seem to want his care. The hardest part was the lack of response. Tramp didn't wag his tail when he appeared, didn't lick his hands, showed no affection. He simply existed nearby, quiet, frightened, like a shadow. Kevin felt like a complete failure. He couldn't even give love and care correctly. He couldn't even manage to save. But despite all the difficulties, despite the fatigue and disappointment, Kevin couldn't bring himself to give up on Tramp. Something held him back. Perhaps the realization that for this dog, he was the last chance. If he gave up now, Tramp would go back to the shelter, and from there, Kevin didn't want to think about it. Every morning upon waking, he saw the dog curled in a ball, and even if the night had been sleepless and another difficult day loomed ahead, this small, living creature in his apartment was the only thing giving any meaning to his existence. His life was no longer completely empty. Tramp was in it. Anxious, difficult, ungrateful, but alive. He started researching dog care, especially for shelter dogs. He read forums, watched videos. He learned about dog body language, how to connect with a frightened animal. It was slow, very slow. Baby steps. Trying to sit nearby, carefully placing food beside him, speaking softly, avoiding sudden movements. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. Tramp stopped cringing at his every move. He started taking food from his hand. One day, while Kevin was sitting on the floor reading, Tramp quietly approached, sniffed his hand, and lay down nearby, though not touching him. It was a small gesture, but for Kevin, it meant more than 1,000 words. It was a glimmer of trust. The first real challenge came when Tramp got sick. Very sick. He refused food, lay listlessly, breathing heavily. Kevin was terrified. It was a visceral fear, not for himself, but for another creature. He dropped everything and rushed the dog to the veterinary clinic. There, amid the unfamiliar smells and procedures, Tramp panicked. He trembled, tried to break free, and suddenly, at the peak of his fear, he instinctively pressed himself against Kevin. He buried his muzzle in Kevin's legs, seeking protection. In that instant, Kevin felt the last shard of ice in his heart melt. The dog, who trusted no one, who feared everything, sought refuge with him, with the person who had saved him. It was the first genuine sign of attachment, the first acknowledgement of his efforts. He held Tramp, calming him with a quiet voice, stroking his head, and he felt the dog gradually relax in his arms. For the first time, he felt needed. Not at work, not in society. Needed by this small, frightened creature. Tramp recovered. But this episode was a turning point. The bond between them strengthened. Tramp was still timid and reserved, but he began to recognize Kevin as his own. He started meeting him at the door, cautiously wagging his tail. He allowed himself to be petted. He slept near his bed. His gaze, though still a bit sad, was no longer so hopeless. Kevin, having overcome the first, most difficult stage, felt a surge of strength. Caring for Tramp gave his life meaning. He developed a routine, walks in the morning and evening, trips to the vet, searching for better food. These were small, everyday things, but they filled his days with substance. He stopped feeling so lonely. There was someone in his life who needed him. And he, the man who considered himself a nobody, turned out to be capable of giving another life. This was his first challenge, not to be a hero, but simply to be there, to be patient, to be caring, despite the lack of immediate reward. And he managed it. He didn't save Tramp in one fell swoop. He saved him every day. And he himself, step by step, was saved from his own loneliness, finding in this small, unassuming dog the most precious thing he had ever had: unconditional, wordless affection. The news from work sounded like a death sentence: downsizing, termination, no severance, no prospects. Kevin left the office in a state of shock. The city noise, which used to just irritate him, now felt crushing, seemed like mockery. In his pocket lay a thin wad of his last cash. His world, already fragile, began to collapse. He spent the first few days frantically trying to find a new job. Any job. As a mover, a general laborer, a courier. He called old acquaintances, the few who still answered. Everywhere, it was either rejection or promises that evaporated into thin air. The job market proved ruthless. Without connections, without an impressive resume, without confidence in his eyes, he was just one of thousands down on their luck. Money melted away before his eyes. Rent, utility bills, what were once minor expenses now loomed like an insurmountable mountain. The worst part was thinking about Tramp. Dog food, even the cheapest kind, cost money. Vet visits, should the dog get sick again, were an unaffordable luxury. Kevin started skimping on himself. He switched to the cheapest pasta, bread, tap water. He skipped meals. Hunger became a constant, gnawing ache in his stomach. The apartment, his only refuge, rapidly deteriorated. He couldn't afford repairs or even cleaning supplies. The smell of dampness and wet fur became pervasive. A layer of dust settled on the furniture. Cold seeped through cracks in the windows. He was saving on heating. He spent evenings in near darkness, not turning on the lights. He sat on the old couch, wrapped in a blanket, and nearby, curled up, lay Tramp. The dog seemed to sense his state. He stopped getting into trouble, grew quieter, pressed closer to Kevin more often, trying to stay warm. In his eyes, though still wary, there was a hint of vague anxiety, reflecting his owner's. Kevin stroked his coarse fur, feeling guilty. Had he saved this dog from the shelter, only to condemn him to hunger and cold beside him? Wasn't that even crueler? Guilt gnawed at him. Guilt towards Tramp. Guilt towards himself for failing. He sat in the darkness, and the loneliness, which had previously been just the backdrop of his life, now became all-consuming. There was no one he could call, talk to, ask for help. He was face to face with his poverty and his failure. There were days when he simply couldn't force himself out of bed. He lay staring at the ceiling, feeling his strength drain away. Hunger, cold, hopelessness, it all merged into a gray, viscous swamp that was sucking him deeper and deeper. Tramp would whimper softly at the bedroom door, urging him to get up, to go for a walk. Kevin would get up, forcing himself for the dog's sake, only for him He started losing weight. His face became gaunt, his eyes sunken. In the mirror, a stranger stared back, haggard, with a week's worth of stubble, in dirty clothes. A man who had lost not only his job and money, but himself, his pride, his remaining self-respect, all trampled by reality. One evening, there was no food left at all. Not a crumb of bread, not an ounce of food for Tramp. Kevin sat in the kitchen, his stomach cramping. Nearby sat Tramp quietly, looking at him with his sad, intelligent eyes. Kevin saw not reproach in them, but simply presence. Quiet, silent devotion. The dog didn't understand what was happening, but he sensed his owner was suffering. Kevin buried his face in his hands. A wave of despair washed over him, stronger than anything he had ever felt. This was rock bottom, absolute bottom. He had failed at everything he'd attempted, couldn't build relationships, couldn't find his place in life, couldn't even save a small, unwanted dog without condemning him to suffer beside him. His life seemed meaningless and futile. He remembered how proudly he had taken Tramp from the shelter, how he had wanted to give him a better life, and this was the result. They were both trapped in this cold, empty apartment, hungry and unwanted. The guilt towards Tramp became unbearable. Dark thoughts entered his mind. What if he took Tramp back to the shelter? Maybe they would euthanize him quickly, painlessly. That was better than starving to death beside him. And as for himself, just disappear. Dissolve into this huge city that wouldn't notice his absence. The thought was tempting in its finality. To end this agonizing struggle, to give up everything, himself. He lifted his head and looked at Tramp. The dog sat there, his eyes fixed on him. There was no expectation of food in his gaze. There was something else, something Kevin couldn't decipher. Affection? Compassion? Understanding? Kevin reached out and hesitantly stroked the dog's head. Tramp, for the first time in a long while, didn't flinch. He gently licked Kevin's hand, with a warm, rough tongue. That small, unexpected gesture pierced Kevin. It wasn't just a physical caress. It was the touch of a living being that accepted him as he was right now. Broken, dirty, hungry. A touch that asked for nothing in return. A touch in which there was no judgment. All the pain, all the despair, all the guilt, it converged in that single moment. He sat in the darkness, at the bottom of his life, and the only light, the only warmth, the only living creature beside him was this dog. This Tramp, whom he had saved, who now, without knowing it, was saving him. Saving him with his presence, with his silent acceptance. He didn't know what would happen next, how he would survive, how Tramp would survive. But at that moment, looking into the dog's devoted eyes and feeling the warmth of his tongue on his hand, Kevin understood one thing. He was not alone. He had Tramp, and for Tramp's sake, he had to endure. He couldn't give up. He couldn't abandon him, not after everything they had been through together. It was the deepest fall, a fall not just into poverty, but into the abyss of despair. But it was at the very bottom of this abyss, in complete darkness, that he saw a faint spark, the spark of devotion in the eyes of the dog he had saved. And that spark became his anchor, a point from which, perhaps, he could still push off. The culmination of suffering turned out to be a moment of quiet, imperceptible insight, seen only with the heart. The cold seeped into his bones. In the darkness of the kitchen, Kevin sat on the floor, clutching his face. His stomach growled, his head spun from weakness and despair. This was the bottom. He felt himself falling, endlessly falling, into an abyss where there was no light or sound, only his own pain and the feeling of utter collapse. The thought of a final exit, of ending this meaningless struggle, seemed almost appealing in its simplicity. The exhaustion was monstrous. It would be so much easier just to let go. And at that very moment, when he was on the brink, when it seemed there wasn't a single reason left to live, he felt a light, rough touch on his hand. A warm tongue. Tramp. The dog sat beside him, completely quiet, not whining, not begging for food, just sitting and looking at him with his large dark eyes, which seemed especially deep in the dim light. They held none of the fear from the shelter, not even expectation. There was only presence. The quiet, non-judgmental presence of a living being who had chosen to be near, who hadn't turned away, hadn't left. Kevin took his hands away from his face. He looked at Tramp. The dog tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand. Kevin reached out and gently stroked his head. This time, Tramp didn't startle, didn't pull back. He simply leaned into Kevin's palm, letting out a soft sigh. His coarse fur, the warmth of his body, it was all so real, so tangible amidst the unbearable unreality of despair. At that moment, Kevin realized. He had saved this dog, pulled him from the shelter, from his cage, from certain death, brought him into his world, however imperfect, gave him a name, fed him, however poorly, cared for him, however clumsily. He was the only person in Tramp's life who had given him a chance. And now this dog, this Tramp he had saved, was the only creature in the world beside him in this darkest hour. The only one who didn't judge, didn't demand, simply was. His presence was a silent reproach, and simultaneously, the most powerful support. If he gave up now, what would happen to Tramp? He'd be returned to the shelter again. Or he'd just be left alone in the empty apartment to slowly die of hunger and cold. The thought was unbearable. It hit harder than any hunger, any cold, any loneliness. He couldn't let that happen, couldn't abandon him, couldn't betray this small creature who had trusted him. His whole life, which had seemed so meaningless, suddenly gained a new, sharp focus. He had to live. He had to endure. For Tramp, his life no longer belonged only to him. It was tied to the life of this dog. He was responsible for him. It wasn't a sudden disappearance of pain or problems. The hunger didn't vanish. The cold didn't retreat. A job didn't magically appear. But something inside had changed. A backbone had formed. The very one he thought had long been broken. It appeared out of love, out of responsibility, out of the invisible bond between two souls who had found each other on the edge of the abyss. Kevin took a deep breath. The air was cold and damp, but he felt the taste of it, the taste of life. Hard, difficult, but life. He slowly, painfully got to his feet. His body ached, his head swam, but he was standing. He went to the window. Outside, the darkness of the night city. But somewhere out there, a new day was waiting. A new day in which he had to find food, find work, find a way out. He had to fight. He turned to Tramp. The dog raised his head, watching him. "We'll manage, Tramp," Kevin said quietly. His voice was hoarse, but firm. "We'll manage, together." He didn't know how, didn't know where the strength would come from, but he knew he would try. For this dog. He went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, trying to wake himself up. He brushed his teeth, a final act of self-care. Then he returned to the kitchen. Scanning it, he began to search for anything he could give Tramp. In the back corner of a cupboard, he found an old package of stale crackers, almost rock hard, and a small, moldy piece of cheese. Not food, but something. He took the crackers and cheese and went to Tramp. The dog rose warily. Kevin offered him the food. Tramp sniffed, then gently took the cheese from Kevin's hand, ate it. Then he started gnawing on a cracker. Watching him, Kevin felt a faint warmth spread through his chest. He had managed to find something, managed to care for him. It was the first step, small, uncertain, but a step forward, from despair to action, from the desire to give up to the decision to fight. Tramp finished the cracker and licked Kevin's hand again, longer than the first time, as if in thanks, or perhaps just expressing his simple affection. Kevin sank down beside him, sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. Exhaustion washed over him, but now it was the fatigue of struggle, a completely different feeling. He closed his eyes, putting an arm around Tramp. The dog snuffled softly, settling beside him. Kevin felt the warmth of his body, felt that he was not alone. He had this dog, his Tramp, his salvation. The turning point wasn't a miraculous deliverance from problems, but the discovery of inner meaning. In the realization that by saving another, you save yourself. That true strength isn't the absence of weakness, but the ability to find a reason to live even at the very bottom. And for Kevin, that reason became the small, unassuming dog from the shelter whom he had saved, expecting nothing in return, and who now, with his quiet presence and unconditional devotion, saved him every day. Life didn't transform overnight. The sky didn't turn blue, and problems didn't vanish with the wave of a magic wand. But Kevin had changed. The inner backbone that had formed in that darkest hour gave him the strength to move forward. He still lived in poverty, searched for work, made ends meet. But now he did it not out of doom, but out of necessity. He had a responsibility. He had Tramp. He continued looking for work, not shying away from any labor. He cleaned yards, unloaded trucks, posted flyers. Any opportunity to earn money for food for himself and Tramp was seized with a desperate grip. He became physically stronger, more resilient. Cold and hunger became his daily reality, but he learned to endure them. The bond with Tramp grew stronger every day. The dog trusted him completely. He waited for him at the door, greeting him with a joyful, though reserved wag of his tail. Slept at his feet, understood him with just a look. They became a real team, two lonely souls who had found each other in the vast city. Tramp became his shadow, his most loyal friend, his silent comfort. Kevin talked to him, shared his thoughts, his fears, his small victories. The dog listened, resting his head on Kevin's knee, and in his intelligent eyes, Kevin found the support he couldn't find in any human. The truth about what had happened to Kevin, his layoff, his poverty, gradually began to leak out. Former colleagues, acquaintances who happened to see him on the street in worn clothes with the shelter dog. Rumors spread. Some pitied him, some gloated, some simply noted indifferently. Kevin? Yeah, heard he hit the skids, maybe drinking or something. Saw him recently, looked like a bum. His former world forgot about him. He became part of the statistics of failures. The climax of the story, the moment of truth, came suddenly. It was an ordinary winter day. Kevin, as usual, had gone out looking for odd jobs, leaving Tramp at home. The weather worsened sharply. Heavy snow began to fall, turning into a blizzard. The wind intensified with each minute. Kevin was working at an outdoor warehouse, hauling something heavy. Suddenly, due to a violent gust of wind, a huge piece of sheet metal tore loose from the roof. It plummeted straight towards Kevin. At that moment, he heard furious barking. Loud, unfamiliar barking. Tramp's bark. How had he gotten here? Kevin didn't even have time to be surprised. The next instant, he felt a powerful impact against his legs. It was Tramp, having run from home, slamming into him with all his might, knocking him off his feet. They both tumbled onto the snow. The huge sheet of metal crashed down with a deafening roar exactly where Kevin had been standing a second before. The impact was so forceful, the ground shook. If Kevin had remained standing, he would have been crushed instantly. He lay in the snow, stunned, deafened by the crash, not immediately understanding what had happened. Above him, trembling with tension and adrenaline, stood Tramp. The dog snarled at the fallen metal, the fur on his neck bristling, his eyes blazing with a fierce fire, the fire of a protector. This was no longer the frightened, withdrawn dog from the shelter. This was a loyal friend who, overcoming his fear of the world, had run through the blizzard to save his person. The sheet metal blocked the path, cutting them off from where the other workers were. Kevin slowly got up, feeling his arms and legs tremble. He looked at Tramp. The dog stopped snarling, turned to Kevin, his gaze anxious, as if checking if he was all right. Tramp, Kevin breathed out. He hugged the dog, tightly, holding him close. He buried his face in his fur, and he felt the dog respond, pressing his whole body close, trembling all over. In that moment, the truth revealed itself in its entirety. He had come to the shelter to save a life, and this saved life, the life of a small, unassuming dog, had repaid the debt. Not with money, not with words, but with the most precious thing, his own life. Tramp, whom he had pulled from death row, had pulled him out from under the wreckage, from death itself. Kevin didn't know how Tramp had found him, perhaps by scent, perhaps sensing trouble, perhaps simply following him. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the dog, who trusted no one, trusted him so much that he overcame his panic fear of the world, the street, danger, to run and save him. This was love, pure, unconditional, asking nothing in return. The very love Kevin had so desperately sought and had found not among people, but in his dog. The truth wasn't whether he was rich or poor. The truth was in this connection, in the dog's act, which showed him that even the loneliest person could be loved, that his life had value. Colleagues and rescuers who rushed over, shocked by what happened, pulled them out from behind the debris. Kevin held Tramp in his arms, refusing to let go. He had been saved by his dog. The story spread quickly, about a man saving a dog, and then the dog saving the man, about a miraculous rescue, about loyalty. The truth about who Kevin was, about his fall and his struggle, seen through the lens of this act, was no longer just a story about a failure. It became a story about humanity, about loyalty, about invisible bonds. Kevin was no longer just an unemployed man from a residential neighborhood. He was the man saved by his dog. That became his new identity. And in this identity, in this connection with Tramp, he found something far more valuable than any money or status. He found meaning, and proof that even at the bottom of life, there is room for miracles, for loyalty, for salvation that comes from where you least expect it. After the incident, the fallen sheet metal became a symbol for Kevin, a symbol of his fall and a symbol of his salvation. Salvation that came not from people, not from money, but from the small, unremarkable dog he had once pulled from a cage. The story of their rescue made the local news. Reporters went to the shelter, found information about Tramp. They filmed a segment about Kevin, how he took the most hopeless dog, how they endured hardships together, and how Tramp repaid his kindness. The story of loyalty and gratitude, seen in a world where these qualities often seem forgotten, touched many. As a result of the story, Kevin began receiving offers. Not from his old acquaintances or colleagues, no. Job offers came from people moved by his story. Ordinary people, owners of small businesses, cafes, shops. They saw in him not just an unemployed man, but a person with a big heart, a person who didn't abandon someone in need. Kevin wasn't immediately used to this attention. He was embarrassed, hadn't expected such a reaction. But he accepted the help. He found work, simple, honest work, that allowed him to live decently and care for Tramp. He no longer went hungry, no longer froze. He and Tramp got their own apartment, modest, but warm and clean. His life had changed. He still wasn't rolling in luxury, didn't move in high society, but he no longer felt alone. He had Tramp, his most loyal friend, who never betrayed him. They walked together in the park, sat watching TV in the evenings, shared the last treat. There was no longer sadness and fear in Tramp's eyes. There was love, devotion, and endless joy at being with his person. Kevin learned to see the world differently. He began to notice those he hadn't seen before. Homeless animals, people in need of help. He started helping the shelter he'd gotten Tramp from, with money, food, or just physical labor. He knew what it was like to be unwanted, and he wanted other living beings not to experience that. He understood that true value isn't in how much you have, but in how much you are able to give. Giving not just material things, but your time, your care, your heart. He saved Tramp, giving him his chance, and Tramp saved him, saving his life. It was the most honest and fair exchange of his life. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. This quote became the motto of his new life. He stopped judging people by their appearance, their status, their wealth. He learned to look with his heart, to see the invisible, kindness behind gruffness, fear behind aggression, loneliness behind indifference. And this ability to see, gifted to him by his Tramp, made him a truly rich man. Rich not with bank accounts, but rich in heart. He never found love in the romantic sense, but he found a much deeper and purer love, the love and devotion of a living creature who became his family. He lost one world, but gained another, a world where loyalty is valued over money, where salvation can come in the form of a wet nose and a wagging tail, where what is essential is visible only to the heart. Often in the evenings, sitting at home, Kevin would stroke Tramp, asleep at his feet. He looked at the city lights beyond the window, lights he once viewed with despair. Now he looked at them with gratitude. Gratitude for his journey, for all the hardships that had led him here, for this dog who had become his guardian angel. He saved a life, and that life saved him. It wasn't a miracle, but a lesson that the strongest bond is invisible, the sincerest gratitude is silent, and the most important salvation is always mutual. He went to the shelter to save a dog from death, and he left it saved from his own emptiness and loneliness. It was the story of two strays who found each other and became everything to one another.